The autumn rain fell steadily over Boston's busy streets as Dr. Maya Thompson checked her watch for the third time. It was 8:45 a.m., and her guest lecture at MIT was scheduled for 9:30. She had prepared for months for this presentation on computational geometry, and being late was not an option. Her research could change how computers process complex mathematical calculations, and the audience would include some of the brightest minds in mathematics. Maya's 10-year-old Toyota Camry moved carefully through the wet streets. The windshield wipers swept back and forth, fighting against the constant drizzle. Her mind was filled with the complex numerical sequences she would soon present, equations that had consumed her life for the past 3 years. Next to her on the passenger seat lay her laptop bag containing hundreds of hours of research work. The morning traffic was lighter than usual, which was a small blessing. Maya maintained a steady speed, watching other cars splash through puddles around her. She had driven this route many times before, as her own office at Boston University was just a few miles away. The familiar path allowed her to mentally review her presentation points while driving. Inside her car, Maya hummed softly to classical music playing at low volume. Bach's mathematics and music always helped her focus. She was dressed professionally in a navy blue blazer and matching skirt, her curly hair neatly pulled back, and minimal jewelry except for the small diamond earrings her mother had given her when she completed her PhD at Stanford. The road ahead was clear when sudden flashing lights in her rearview mirror startled her from her thoughts. Maya's heart rate quickened as she carefully pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to find a safe spot away from the deeper puddles. She had been driving for 15 years without a single ticket, and she was certain she hadn't been speeding. The police officer approached her window, rain dripping from his cap. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with a stern expression that seemed practice rather than natural. Maya rolled down her window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel just as her father had taught her years ago. "License and registration, please," the officer said, his tone clipped and professional. Maya noticed his nameplate read, "Officer Sullivan." "Of course, officer," Maya replied calmly, reaching slowly for her glove compartment. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the documents, not from fear, but from the growing anxiety about being late for her lecture. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Sullivan asked, studying her paperwork. "No, sir, I don't," Maya answered truthfully. "I was being very careful about my speed, especially with the wet roads." The officer's expression didn't change. "You were doing 45 in a 35 zone, ma'am. There's a school zone just back there." Maya's brow furrowed in confusion. She knew this route well. The school zone he mentioned was still 2 blocks ahead, not behind them. She had been planning to slow down when she reached it, just as she always did. "Officer, I believe there might be a mistake," she said politely. "The school zone starts at Sater Street, which is 2 blocks ahead. I always drive this route to work." Officer Sullivan's face hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I've been patrolling this area for 3 years. I know where the school zones are." Maya wanted to argue further, but remembered her father's voice again. Sometimes being right isn't worth the fight. She sat quietly as the officer returned to his patrol car with her documents. Through her side mirror, Maya watched him typing on his computer. The minutes ticked by slowly as the rain continued to fall. Her watch now showed 9:00 a.m. The knot in her stomach grew tighter. She would definitely be late now. When Officer Sullivan returned, his demeanor had grown even more stern. "I'm issuing you a citation for speeding in a school zone," he announced, holding out a ticket. "This requires a mandatory court appearance. The date and time are listed at the bottom." Maya's heart sank as she accepted the ticket. Her perfect driving record was about to be marred by what she knew was a mistake, but more importantly, she was now going to be significantly late for her lecture. The years of research, the careful preparation, the eager audience of mathematical minds. Everything was being thrown off course by this morning's unexpected turn of events. As the patrol car pulled away, Maya sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She pulled out her phone to call MIT and warn them about her delay. The rain continued to drum on her car roof, and Bach's mathematical harmonies played on, now seeming more like a mockery than a comfort. Little did she know, this traffic stop was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge not only her patience but also deeply rooted societal prejudices. 2 weeks after the traffic incident, Maya stood in the crowded hallway of the Boston Municipal Court. The building's harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floor, creating an uncomfortable glare. She had arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in a simple black pantsuit with a white blouse, her hair neatly arranged in a professional bun. Her MIT lecture notes were tucked into her bag. She had another presentation scheduled for later that afternoon. Around her, people shuffled through security checkpoints and consulted posted schedules on the walls. The air smelled of coffee and anxiety, a mixture of morning beverages and nervous energy that seemed to fill every courthouse. Maya checked her citation again, confirming courtroom 304, even though she had memorized the number days ago. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the courtroom doors opened. Maya took a seat in the third row, placing her bag carefully beside her. The wooden bench was hard and uncomfortable, much like the entire situation. She watched as other people filed in, traffic violators, minor offenders, and their families. Many looked stressed, some appeared angry, and a few seemed completely lost. Judge Richard Harrison entered the courtroom at 9:15 a.m. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. His black robe swished as he walked to the bench, barely acknowledging the bailiff's call for everyone to rise. Maya noticed how he barely glanced at the assembled crowd before taking his seat. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed without question. He picked up a stack of papers, adjusting his glasses as he began to read through the morning's cases. The first hour passed slowly. Maya watched as case after case was called, each lasting only a few minutes. Judge Harrison's style became clear. He was efficient but showed little patience for explanations or excuses. His responses were quick, his judgments faster, and his fines seemed to follow a pattern that had little to do with the individual circumstances presented. Case number 247, the clerk finally called. Thompson Maya, speeding in a school zone. Maya stood smoothly, her hands clasped in front of her. As she walked to the podium, she felt Judge Harrison's eyes sweep over her briefly before returning to his papers. It was a dismissive glance, one she had experienced many times before in academic circles, before proving her expertise. "Miss Thompson," he began, not looking up from the citation, "you were caught doing 45 in a 35-mile-per-hour school zone. How do you plead?" "Your Honor." Maya started, her voice clear and steady. "I would like to explain the circumstances." "That wasn't my question," Judge Harrison interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were cold behind his glasses. "How do you plead to the charge of speeding in a school zone?" Maya took a deep breath. "Not guilty, Your Honor. There appears to be a misunderstanding about the location of the school zone. Officer Sullivan," Judge Harrison cut in again, "has been patrolling that area for 3 years. Are you suggesting he doesn't know where the school zones are in his own patrol area?" The prosecutor, a young woman in a gray suit, stood up. "Your Honor, Officer Sullivan's report clearly states the defendant was observed speeding in the designated school zone on Cedar Street. We have the radar reading and the officer's sworn statement." Maya tried again. "Your Honor, if I could just show you the map." "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison's voice carried a note of irritation now. "This court has more pressing matters than debating the geography of school zones with traffic violators. Officer Sullivan is a decorated member of the force with an impeccable record. The evidence is clear." The judge shuffled some papers on his desk, his decision already made before Maya could present her defense. The wooden podium felt cold under her fingers as she gripped it, watching years of careful driving and respect for the law being dismissed without consideration. "The court finds you guilty of speeding in a school zone," Judge Harrison announced, his tone suggesting this was the obvious outcome all along. "You are fined $500, to be paid within 30 days. Additionally, you will attend a driver safety course. Next case." Maya stood for a moment, stunned by the abruptness of it all. The bailiff gestured for her to step away from the podium. As she gathered her bag and walked out of the courtroom, she could hear the clerk already calling the next case number. Her perfect driving record was now marred, not by her actions, but by assumptions and prejudices she had faced her entire professional life. Outside in the hallway, Maya checked her watch. She had 2 hours before her MIT lecture. Plenty of time to stop by her office and collect her thoughts. Little did Judge Harrison know, their paths would cross again very soon, in circumstances that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the woman he had so quickly judged. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she stood at the courthouse payment window. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the worn counter where she was about to pay her $500 fine. The clerk behind the glass partition looked bored, probably having processed hundreds of similar payments that week. Citation number, the clerk asked without looking up from her computer screen. Maya recited the number from memory. She had stared at the citation so many times over the past hour that the digits were burned into her mind. As the clerk typed, Maya's thoughts drifted back to the courtroom scene that had unfolded just 45 minutes earlier. She had tried to stay after her case, watching as Judge Harrison handled other cases. His pattern became clear. White defendants received longer speaking times, more attention to their explanations, and often reduced fines. The realization made her stomach turn. In 15 years of academia, she had faced subtle discrimination, but rarely something this blatant. The clerk's voice pulled her back to the present. That'll be $500. Cash, credit, or debit. As Maya reached for her wallet, she overheard a conversation from the courtroom doors behind her. Judge Harrison was speaking with another judge in the hallway, their voices carrying in the marble corridor. Sometimes you have to teach them responsibility, Harrison was saying, his tone self-satisfied. A steep fine usually gets the message across. Can't have people thinking they can talk their way out of everything. Maya's credit card paused halfway to the payment window. She knew he was talking about her case. It had been the only maximum fine he'd imposed all morning. The other judge murmured something in response, and their footsteps echoed away down the hall. The clerk cleared her throat impatiently. Maya completed the payment, her movements mechanical. The receipt printer whirred to life, spitting out a piece of paper that felt far too small for the amount of money it represented. As she walked toward the courthouse exit, Maya passed a bulletin board covered with community notices. One caught her eye, an announcement for the upcoming Mathematics and Innovation Conference at the city's Science Center. She was supposed to be the keynote speaker, presenting her groundbreaking work on geometric algorithms. The irony wasn't lost on her. In one building, she was dismissed as just another traffic violator, while across town her name was printed in bold letters as a leading mathematician. Outside, the autumn air had turned cooler. Maya checked her phone, 3 missed calls from her department head at Boston University, and an email from the conference organizers confirming her presentation schedule. Real life was continuing despite this morning's injustice. She walked to her car, parked in the 2-hour visitor spot. The same Toyota Camry that Officer Sullivan had pulled over, though now it carried a marked driver instead of one with a perfect record. Maya sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and opened the street map of the area where she'd received the ticket. The school zone sign was exactly where she remembered, 2 blocks ahead of where Officer Sullivan had stopped her. She had driven that route hundreds of times, knowing every traffic sign, every crosswalk, every speed limit change. The tablet screen also showed her email inbox. Among the usual academic correspondence was a message about her recent paper being accepted for publication in the International Journal of Computational Mathematics. The contrast was stark. In her professional world, her words carried weight, her calculations were trusted, her expertise was respected. Maya finally started her car. She had a lunch meeting with NASA representatives about implementing her algorithms in their next-generation spacecraft navigation systems. They valued her mind, her work, her contributions to science. Yet here, in this courthouse, none of that mattered to Judge Harrison. To him, she was just another face, another case number, another stereotype to be dismissed. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Maya noticed Judge Harrison walking to his car, a new Mercedes sedan that probably cost more than her annual research grant. He didn't notice her, just as he hadn't really noticed her in the courtroom, but soon, very soon, you would have to see her for who she really was. The traffic light turned green, and Maya drove away from the courthouse. Her fine was paid, but the story wasn't over. In fact, it was about to take a turn that neither she nor Judge Harrison could have anticipated. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in unexpected packages, and this particular package was scheduled to be delivered at the Science Center board meeting later that afternoon. Judge Richard Harrison adjusted his tie as he walked into the Boston Science Center's main conference room. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating the modern space with its sleek furniture and state-of-the-art presentation screens. As a board member, he attended these meetings monthly, though usually his mind stayed on court cases rather than scientific matters. Today's meeting was special. The director was announcing the keynote speaker for their annual Mathematics and Innovation Conference, an event that brought significant prestige and funding to the center. Harrison took his usual seat near the head of the long table, nodding to fellow board members as they arrived. "Richard, glad you could make it," said Dr. Sarah Chen, the center's director, as she organized her papers at the podium. "We have exciting news about next month's conference." Her enthusiasm was obvious, making Harrison wonder what could cause such excitement about a mathematics presentation. The meeting began with usual business: budget reports, renovation updates, and upcoming events. Harrison checked his watch discreetly, thinking about the stack of cases waiting on his desk back at the courthouse. His morning had been typically busy, including that traffic violation case where the woman had tried to argue about school zone locations. He pushed the memory aside as Dr. Chen moved to the main announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, clicking her remote to start the presentation, "I'm thrilled to announce our keynote speaker for this year's Mathematics and Innovation Conference." The large screen behind her came to life with a professional photograph. Harrison's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. His hand froze in mid-air as he stared at the image on the screen. The woman in the photograph was wearing a professional blazer, her curly hair neatly styled, with a confident smile, the same woman he had found just hours ago. "Dr. Maya Thompson," Dr. Chen continued proudly, "has revolutionized the field of computational geometry with her groundbreaking algorithms. Her work has transformed how we process complex mathematical calculations in everything from spacecraft navigation to medical imaging." The next slide showed Dr. Thompson's credentials. Harrison's coffee cup clicked loudly against its saucer as he set it down with trembling hands. Stanford PhD, Princeton Fellowship, Oxford Research Chair, NASA Consultant, National Medal of Science recipient, Fields Medal nominee, the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in mathematics. Dr. Thompson's recent paper on geometric optimization has been called the most significant advancement in computational mathematics in the past decade, Dr. Chen explained, switching to a slide showing journal covers featuring Dr. Thompson's work. Her algorithms have reduced processing time for complex calculations from hours to minutes. Harrison's collar felt tight as he remembered interrupting her attempts to explain herself in court. The woman he had dismissed so easily held patents that were transforming modern computing. The person he had lectured about responsibility was advising NASA on spacecraft trajectories. Additionally, Dr. Chen beamed, "Dr. Thompson has just received a $2.5 million grant from the National Science Foundation to establish a new research center here in Boston. She'll be collaborating with MIT, Harvard, and Boston University to develop next-generation computing solutions." The room broke into enthusiastic applause. Harrison's hands remained still in his lap as he remembered his words in the hallway about teaching them responsibility. Each achievement listed on the screen felt like a personal rebuke to his hasty judgments. "We're expecting over 1,000 attendees," Dr. Chen continued, showing slides of previous conferences. "Dr. Thompson's presence has already attracted registration from leading scientists and mathematicians across the globe. This will be our most prestigious conference to date." As the presentation continued, Harrison barely heard the words. His mind replayed the morning's court session in excruciating detail, how he had cut off her explanations, dismissed her attempts to show evidence, and imposed the maximum fine without a second thought. He had treated a globally respected scientist like a common traffic violator, all because of what? Her appearance? Her gender? Her race? The meeting moved on to other topics, but Harrison remained lost in thought. His years on the bench had trained him to evaluate evidence and make fair judgments, yet this morning he had failed spectacularly at both. The weight of his prejudiced behavior pressed down on him like a physical force. As board members around him discussed conference logistics, Harrison realized that his comfortable worldview had just been shattered. The carefully constructed justifications he had built for his efficient courtroom management lay in ruins, exposed by a simple presentation about a brilliant mathematician whom he had wronged just hours before. The conference room slowly emptied after the board meeting, but Judge Harrison remained seated, staring at the now dark presentation screen. His leather briefcase sat untouched beside his chair, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across its polished surface. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, forgotten during Dr. Chen's presentation about Dr. Maya Thompson. "Richard, are you all right?" Dr. Chen asked, gathering her papers at the podium. "You seem distracted." Harrison forced a weak smile. "Sarah, could you send me Dr. Thompson's full biography? I'd like to familiarize myself with her work before the conference." "Of course." Dr. Chen brightened, pulling up the file on her tablet. "She's absolutely brilliant. Did you know she solved the Kleinberg geometric rooting problem? It's been stumping mathematicians for decades." As Dr. Chen spoke, Harrison's tablet pinged with the received file. He opened it, and Dr. Thompson's professional headshot appeared, the same face that had stood before him in court that morning, trying to explain about the school zone. Only now, he was seeing her through very different eyes. The biography was extensive. Maya Thompson had shown mathematical genius from an early age, winning national competitions throughout high school. She had earned a full scholarship to Stanford, where she completed both her undergraduate and doctoral degrees in record time. Her thesis on computational geometry had earned international recognition. Harrison scrolled further, each achievement making him sink lower in his chair. Research fellowships at Princeton and Oxford. Guest lecturer at MIT. Advisor to NASA's deep space navigation projects. Multiple patents that had revolutionized computer processing speeds. The National Medal of Science, presented at the White House. And most recently, a nomination for the Fields Medal, mathematics' highest honor. Her work on geometric algorithms is changing everything, Dr. Chen continued enthusiastically, unaware of Harrison's growing discomfort. Medical imaging, climate modeling, space exploration, they're all using her methods now. We're incredibly lucky to have her as our keynote speaker. Harrison nodded mechanically, his mind replaying their courtroom encounter in painful detail. He remembered her attempting to show him something on her tablet, probably the same map he had refused to look at. He had dismissed her with the practiced ease of someone who had stopped seeing individuals and started seeing categories. "Did you know she's also running a program to encourage young women and minorities in mathematics?" Dr. Chen added, pointing to a section of the biography. "She visits schools in underprivileged areas, sharing her love for mathematics. The program has already produced 3 Rhodes Scholars." The irony felt like a physical blow. While Dr. Thompson was lifting others up, he had been pushing her down. His courtroom, which should have been a place of justice, had become a stage for his own prejudices. Harrison gathered his things slowly, his movements heavy with realization. Walking to his car in the parking garage, he passed a wall of framed newspapers. One showed Dr. Thompson accepting her National Medal of Science, her smile bright and confident as she stood at the White House podium, the same woman he had treated like an ignorant traffic offender just hours ago. In his car, Harrison didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he pulled up the court records on his tablet, finding Dr. Thompson's case from that morning. His notes seemed embarrassingly arrogant now. Defendant argumentative about school zone location. Maximum fine imposed to ensure compliance. The garage's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he sat there, confronting his own prejudices. How many other Dr. Thompsons had stood before him? How many brilliant minds, capable leaders, and valuable contributors to society had he judged unfairly based on quick glances and unconscious biases? His calendar reminder buzzed. Afternoon court session would begin in 30 minutes. But for the first time in his 15 years on the bench, Harrison didn't feel qualified to sit in judgment of others. The weight of his morning's behavior pressed down on him like a physical force. As he finally started his car, Harrison realized that the true judgment today hadn't happened in his courtroom. It had happened here, in this parking garage, where his own biases and assumptions had been laid bare by a simple presentation about a brilliant mathematician whom he had wronged. The question now was, what would he do about it? That evening, Judge Harrison sat in his home study, surrounded by law books and legal journals that had guided his career for decades. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, broken only by the warm glow of his desk lamp. On his computer screen, the court transcript from Dr. Thompson's case stared back at him, each line more damning than the last. He had canceled his afternoon court session, something he had never done before in 15 years on the bench. The clerk had been surprised, but Harrison knew he couldn't face another case until he had confronted what happened that morning. Now, in the quiet of his study, he began to truly examine his actions. The defendant attempted to present evidence regarding school zone location. The transcript read. Harrison remembered cutting her off, not even glancing at the map she tried to show. He pulled up the city planning website, checking the school zone boundaries. Dr. Thompson had been right. The zone started 2 blocks ahead of where Officer Sullivan had stopped her. His finger traced down the transcript, each interaction revealing his biases more clearly. He had interrupted her 4 times in less than 3 minutes. When she tried to explain her regular route to work, he had dismissed her knowledge of an area she drove through daily. The evidence had been there, but he hadn't wanted to see it. Harrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook, his personal journal of memorable cases. Over the years, he had recorded instances that shaped his judicial philosophy. Now, he began to write about today, forcing himself to be honest about what he saw in his own behavior. I didn't see Dr. Maya Thompson today, he wrote. I saw what I expected to see. I didn't hear her words. I heard what I assumed she would say. 20 years on the bench, and I've become what I once fought against. The judge stood up and walked to his wall of photographs. Awards for judicial excellence. Commendations for community service. News clippings about his appointment to the bench. He had always prided himself on being fair and impartial. Yet today had shown him how far he had strayed from those ideals. Returning to his desk, Harrison pulled up Dr. Thompson's case file again. Her driver's record was perfect, not a single ticket in 15 years. The fine he had imposed was the maximum allowed, justified with a curt note about teaching responsibility. The irony of trying to teach responsibility to someone who advised NASA on multimillion-dollar space missions wasn't lost on him. He opened another file, his own records of fines imposed over the past year. The patterns were clear, though he had never noticed them before. White defendants received lower fines on average. Their explanations were more likely to be heard fully. Their evidence was more likely to be considered. The data painted a picture he could no longer ignore. Harrison's phone buzzed, a reminder about tomorrow's court schedule. 32 cases, each one representing a person who would stand before him, looking for justice. How many had he judged unfairly? How many brilliant minds, dedicated professionals, and valuable community members had he dismissed without a proper hearing? On his tablet, he opened Dr. Thompson's biography again. Her achievements scrolled past. Breakthrough algorithms, international awards, life-changing research. But it was the section about her community work that really caught his attention now. She mentored young students from underprivileged backgrounds, showing them that mathematics could open doors to new opportunities. The clock on his wall ticked steadily as Harrison sat in his leather chair, confronting decades of unconscious bias. He had entered the legal profession to ensure justice was served equally. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that goal, falling into the comfortable routine of quick judgments and hasty assumptions. His court reporter had once told him that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but wisdom to see beyond appearances. Today had taught him how far he had drifted from that wisdom. The question now was what to do about it. Harrison picked up his pen again, turning to a fresh page in his journal. Today, he wrote, I learned that justice wears no robes. It comes in all forms, all colors, all backgrounds. My duty is not to judge based on appearances, but to truly see the person standing before me. As midnight approached, Judge Harrison made 2 decisions. First, he would need to make this right with Dr. Thompson, and second, his courtroom would need to change. The question was no longer whether to act, but how to begin making amends for years of biased judgment. 3 days after the Science Center board meeting, Judge Harrison stood in the mathematics building at Boston University. The hallway walls were covered with complex equations and scientific posters, making him feel distinctly out of place. He had left his judicial robes behind, wearing instead a simple gray suit that felt like inadequate armor for the task ahead. Outside Dr. Thompson's office, he paused to read the nameplate. Dr. Maya Thompson, Ph.D., Professor of Computational Mathematics. Below it, a bulletin board displayed newspaper clippings about her achievements and thank you notes from students she had mentored. A recent article highlighted her nomination for the Fields Medal, describing her as one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of our generation. Harrison knocked on the door, his heart pounding. He had faced hardened criminals in his courtroom with less anxiety than he felt now. A voice from inside called, "Come in." Dr. Thompson's office was exactly what you might expect from a leading mathematician. Whiteboards covered in complex equations, computer screens displaying geometric models, and books stacked on every available surface. She looked up from her desk, and Harrison saw the flash of recognition cross her face. "Judge Harrison," she said, her voice neutral but her posture stiffening slightly. "This is unexpected." "Dr. Thompson," Harrison began, remaining near the door. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. May I have a few minutes of your time?" She gestured to a chair, pushing aside a stack of research papers to create space between them. The afternoon sun streamed through her office window, illuminating a wall of awards and certificates that made Harrison's guilt weigh even heavier. "First," he said, settling uncomfortably in the chair, "I was wrong about the school zone. I checked the city planning maps. You were correct about its location. The ticket should never have been issued." Dr. Thompson nodded but remained silent, her eyes studying him with the same precision she probably used to analyze mathematical problems. "But that's just the beginning," Harrison continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "I treated you unfairly in my courtroom. I didn't listen to your explanation. I didn't examine your evidence. I made assumptions based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had until I saw your presentation at the Science Center board meeting." A small smile touched Dr. Thompson's lips. "That must have been quite a moment for you." "It was enlightening," Harrison admitted, "and deeply shameful. I've spent the past few days reviewing my court records, and I found patterns of bias in my rulings that I can no longer ignore." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. "I've already filed the paperwork to dismiss your ticket and fine. It's not much, but it's a start." Dr. Thompson took the paper, glancing at it briefly before setting it aside. Above her desk, a framed equation caught Harrison's eye, something about optimal paths through complex systems. "You know, Judge Harrison," she said, leaning forward slightly, "in mathematics, we have this concept called error correction. When we find a mistake in our calculations, we don't just erase it. We study it. We learn from it. We use it to improve our future work." Harrison nodded slowly. "In law, we have precedents, previous decisions that guide future judgments. I'm realizing that some of my precedents need to be re-examined. It takes courage to admit mistakes," Dr. Thompson said, her voice softening slightly, "especially when those mistakes come from biases we carried for years without questioning them." "I'm implementing new procedures in my courtroom," Harrison explained. "Mandatory time for evidence review, structured testimony periods, written justification for all fines. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Dr. Thompson stood and walked to her whiteboard, where a complex diagram showed multiple pathways converging to a single point. "In my work," she said, "we often find that the shortest path isn't always the best one. Sometimes we need to take longer routes to reach better solutions." Harrison understood the metaphor. His efficient courtroom management had really been a shortcut that bypassed true justice. "Dr. Thompson, I know an apology doesn't erase what happened, but I want you to know that your case has changed how I'll approach every future decision from my bench." She turned back to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Judge Harrison, the true test of an apology isn't in the words spoken today. It's in the actions taken tomorrow." 6 months after the traffic court incident, Judge Harrison stood at a podium in the Massachusetts Judicial Conference Center. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, and court administrators from across the state. Behind him, a presentation slide displayed statistics from his courtroom's new bias monitoring system. "The numbers don't lie," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "In my first 15 years on the bench, I showed consistent patterns of bias in fine amounts, speaking time allowed, and evidence consideration. I didn't see it then. I didn't want to see it. But thanks to one remarkable woman, I couldn't ignore it anymore." In the front row, Dr. Maya Thompson sat watching quietly. She had agreed to join him for this presentation, adding powerful credibility to his message. She wore the same professional attire she had worn to court that day, but now the audience saw her differently. A Fields Medal nominee and leading mathematician choosing to help reform the justice system. "We've implemented new procedures," Harrison continued, changing the slide to show his courtroom's new guidelines. Every defendant gets equal speaking time. All evidence must be reviewed and documented. Fines are determined by standardized criteria, not snap judgments. The results have been eye-opening. The next slide showed the changes. Racial and gender disparities in fines had dropped significantly. Case appeals had decreased by 40%. Public trust ratings had improved. Small changes in procedure had led to big changes in justice. Meanwhile, across town at MIT, Dr. Thompson was making changes of her own. She had expanded her mentoring program, using her experience to teach young scientists about perseverance in the face of prejudice. Her office now included a framed copy of her dismissed traffic ticket alongside her many awards, a reminder that change was possible. The most dangerous bias, Harrison told his audience, is the one we don't recognize. I thought I was being efficient. I thought I was being fair. I was wrong. It took a brilliant mathematician to show me the flaws in my calculations. In the months since their meeting, Harrison and Dr. Thompson had developed an unexpected partnership. She now guest lectured at judicial training sessions, using mathematical models to demonstrate how small biases could create large systematic inequalities. Her precise, analytical approach helped other judges understand their own unconscious patterns. After the conference, they met in the building's coffee shop. Dr. Thompson was preparing for her upcoming Fields Medal ceremony in Paris, while Harrison was scheduled to teach a seminar on bias recognition at the National Judicial College. Your story reached the Supreme Court, Dr. Thompson mentioned, stirring her coffee. They're considering implementing similar monitoring systems in federal courts. Harrison nodded, remembering how resistant he had once been to such oversight. Changes that seemed impossible 6 months ago now feel inevitable. Sometimes we need a push to see what's right in front of us. Outside, students from a nearby high school were touring the courthouse. Harrison noticed Dr. Thompson watching them, particularly a young black girl who was asking enthusiastic questions about the legal system. That's why this matters, Dr. Thompson said softly. Every time a judge makes a biased decision, they're not just affecting one person. They're sending a message about who belongs where, whose voice matters, whose evidence counts. Harrison understood. His old behaviors hadn't just harmed individuals, they had reinforced systemic barriers. But now, his courtroom was becoming a model for change. Other judges were adopting his new procedures. Law schools were using his case studies in their ethics classes. As they parted ways, Dr. Thompson to her geometric algorithms and Harrison to his afternoon court session. Both carried the lesson of their chance encounter. One traffic stop had sparked a transformation in the justice system. One moment of prejudice had led to lasting change. In Harrison's courtroom, a new sign hung behind the bench. Justice requires both eyes open. And in Dr. Thompson's lecture hall, she began each semester by telling her students about the day a traffic ticket helped change the legal system. The story became a symbol of how progress happens, not always through grand gestures, but through individual moments of recognition, responsibility, and commitment to change. In the end, true justice, like mathematics, required constant questioning, careful analysis, and the courage to correct our errors.